Okay, we're at chapter 11, Tumtum and Nutmeg. General March Mouse is in the house. Arthur and Lucy had spent the day in a great state of anticipation, wondering when Nutmeg would carry out her promise to make Aunt Ivy vanish. They had no idea what method fairies of sorts used to get rid of ants, but they suspected that Aunt Ivy's disappearance might prove to be rather dramatic. Do you think she'll try to frighten her away? Arthur asked Lucy when they woke up to find Nutmeg's note on the dresser. I shouldn't think so, his sister replied. Nutmeg must be much too small to frighten her. If she's going to make her vanish, she'll do it by magic. She'll probably just wave a wand and make her disappear in a puff of smoke. Where would she make her go? Arthur asked. Oh, I don't know, Lucy said, trying to sound more laid back about it than she felt. If she's feeling merciful, she might just magic her back home to Scotland, but perhaps there's an especially horrid place where fairies magic away all the people that they don't like. Arthur shivered. It was a terrifying thought. The children spent the day loitering downstairs, monitoring Aunt Ivy around the clock, lest they miss the moment of her vanishing. They even trailed after her when she went to the village shop, but they made sure never to get too close, as they expected she might go up and smoke at any minute, and they were frightened of getting singed. And yet by supper time, she was still there. She spent the evening sitting at the kitchen table, filing her nails and ranting about how she was going to exterminate Rose Cottage's rodents by squirting citrus-scented hairspray under the dresser. By the time the children had climbed up to the attic stairs to go to bed, they were beginning to feel quite despondent. Very sad. Despondent means you're very sad. Nutmeg had had the whole day to make Aunt Ivy vanish, so why hadn't she done it? You do think she can do it, don't you? Arthur asked tentatively, but by now even Lucy was starting to have doubts. Okay, and there's the page break. So we're going to change time or place. It was up to the officers to carry out Nutmeg's promise, and once she provided them with a basic plan of attack, they sat up late into the night, thrashing out tactics. Shortly after midnight, the general and Colonel Acorn went to make a reconnaissance of the ground floor of the cottage, which they now referred to as the battle zone. They sketched out detailed plans of the kitchen and the hall, and then they crept into the living room while Aunt Ivy was sleeping, and they noted down the exact position of each bit of furniture, even the log basket. When they got back to Nutmouse Hall, they pinned their maps up in the library, and the general spent the next hour or so sticking red pins in them. Mrs. Marchmouse scuttled in and out with trays of cocoa, while Nutmeg sat with Tumtum as he tossed and turned on his sickbed with no inkling of what was going on. It was not until the small hours of Friday morning that a final strategy was formed. General Marchmouse stood between his officers, a bacon sandwich in hand, and ran through it point by point. It was a complicated plan, so each mouse took notes in a special Royal Mouse Army code. At dawn, 7 of the officers, led by Colonel Acorn, would leave Rose Cottage and spend the morning enlisting recruits, 200 or thereabouts, from the village. General Marchmouse and the remaining 4 officers would mount guard at Nutmouse Hall in case Aunt Ivy made any premature advances. The plan did not specify what they would do if she did. The new recruits would be marched back to Nutmouse Hall by 1 o'clock and be divided into 11 platoons, with each platoon under the command of an officer. And then at some point during the afternoon, whenever the coast became clear, the army would march into the Rose Cottage living room and take up position. 1 platoon would spread out behind the books on the bookshelf, 1 would lie in wait beneath the armchair, 1 would crawl through the tear in the sofa cover and hide in the stuffing, another would lurk in the chimney, and another in the log basket. There would be platoons in every corner of the room, poised to attack. The general would mount guard behind the flower pot on the mantelpiece, from where he would have a sweeping view of the battlefield. And thus would the mice bide their time until evening, when Aunt Ivy finally retired to the living room and started getting ready for bed. And then the general would fire his pistol, signaling the charge, and they would all race toward her together in one squealing, scrabbling, fearless stampede. The general could not make any plans beyond that, as he did not know how Aunt Ivy would react, so he adopted a policy of hoping for the best. When she sees the size of our army, she will run for her life, he said emphatically. It's a capital strategy, General, Colonel Acorn said, raising a mug of cocoa to him. Quite astoundingly brilliant, even by your standards. I suppose you could argue that it's one of my more imaginative ones, agreed the general, who by now had quite forgotten that the idea owed anything to Nutmeg at all. General, And yet one of the officers, a brigadier with tousled auburn hair and smart leather boots that rose up to his knees, seemed uneasy. "One thing concerns me, General," he said. "When the enemy gets into bed, she might put her light out straight away, and then she wouldn't be able to see us. And if you were standing on the mantelpiece, you wouldn't be able to see the platoons. We'd be fighting blind." The general looked pensive. It was keen thinking. "Have you anything to suggest, Brigadier?" "Well," the brigadier said, "I suppose we could all carry candles, but that might be something of a fire hazard when the time came to charge." "Much too dangerous," the general agreed. "We don't want to burn the cottage down." "Why don't we dress the troops in fluorescent uniforms?" Colonel Acorn suggested. It's a good idea, Colonel," the general said, "but how are we going to get a hold of 200 fluorescent uniforms by tomorrow night?" The officers considered this problem for a moment, and none could resolve it. But then the general remembered the child's bicycle he had seen propped up outside Rose Cottage by the garden door, and he pursed his lips. At that moment, he heard Nutmeg and Mrs. Marchmouse passing outside in the corridor. "Ladies, a moment, please," he bellowed, calling them into the library. "Mrs. Nutmouse, does either of the Mildew children possess a cycling jacket?" he asked mysteriously. "You know, the garish sort that humans wear when they cycle on the roads at night." "Why, yes, General, Arthur has one," she said, "a fluorescent orange one hanging on the back of the kitchen door." "And would he miss it if we were to borrow it on a permanent basis?" the general asked. "I shouldn't think so," Nutmeg said, trying to imagine what this was all about. "He never uses his bicycle because it has punctures in both tires." "Good," the general said, and then he turned to Nutmeg and Mrs. Marchmouse, looking very grave. "I need your help," he said. "If we were to retrieve that jacket, could you turn it into 200 mouse-size uniforms by 1300 hours tomorrow afternoon?" "Goodness," Nutmeg said, and Mrs. Marchmouse shook her head. 200 uniforms by lunchtime tomorrow? It was out of the question. She looked at her husband regretfully. "I'm sorry, darling, but even if we worked nonstop, we could probably only manage 5 uniforms by then. Sewing trousers and jackets isn't as easy as it looks, you know. There's the legs and the sleeves and the hem and the cuffs and the—" Yes, I understand all about that," the general interrupted, even though he didn't really understand about it at all. "But what about something less ambitious? Armbands, let us say. Could you make 200 fluorescent armbands by tomorrow afternoon?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Marchmouse said eagerly. "We could run up 200 armbands in no time, couldn't we, Mrs. Nutmouse?" "Of course," Nutmeg agreed. "They wouldn't even need hemming." "Excellent," the general cried, rubbing his hands together, and then he turned back to face the officers. "Very well, gentlemen, from now on, we shall refer to this operation as the Charge of the Bright Brigade, after that glorious human battle that took place in... The general looked around, hoping someone might prompt him, but everyone looked blank. Well, he said hurriedly, "in the days of Queen Victoria." The officers supposed the general was thinking about the Charge of the Light Brigade, which happened not to have been very glorious at all, but they did not like to contradict him, so Charge of the Bright Brigade was how the operation came to be known. "The Charge of the Bright Brigade!" Colonel Acorn cried, raising his sword in the air, and then all the other mice cried it too, except for Nutmeg, who had already dashed off to find her sewing basket. Let's see if I have time to read the rest of this right now. I think so. Okay. The cycling jacket had been left on a coat peg high up in the kitchen door, but the officers managed to reach it by climbing up the strings of an apron that had hung beside it. And then they teased it off the peg and dragged it back under the dresser. Colonel Acorn used his sword to cut it into little pieces small enough to fit through the Nutmouse's front gates. And then they carried all the fragments into the living room of Nutmouse Hall, where Nutmeg and Mrs. Marchmouse got to work with their scissors. The mice worked without pause, sitting by Tumtum's bedside. How Nutmeg longed to shake Tumtum awake and tell him that General Marchmouse was going to rouse a whole army to save him. But he was much too weak to take such excitements on board. Here they are getting the vest, like a cycling vest, or, you know, if somebody goes out and runs in the dark and they need a reflective surface so cars can see them. Some of the officers managed to grab a few hours of sleep during what remained of the night, stretched out on soft leather chairs in the library, but at the first hint of dawn, the hustle and bustle began. Colonel Acorn and his party set off for the village to round up the troops, and the other officers waited tensely for their return, pacing back and forth in the war room. As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere in Nutmouse Hall thickened, and by the time the living room clock struck 1, Mrs. Marchmouse and Nutmeg had assembled some 220 or so armbands. They ran up a few extra ones for good measure, But Colonel Acorn had still not come back. And by the time the clock struck 2, General Marchmouse had shuffled his toy soldiers back and forth so many times that his eyes were beginning to boggle, and there was still no sign of the troops. Finally, at 3:10, the officers heard a loud commotion outside. The general straightened his beret and marched out of the front door towards the gates, and through them he saw a great rabble of troops, their cold noses glinting softly in the gloom beneath the dresser. He tried to count them, but he couldn't. There were scores, hundreds of them, a multitude of excited, jabbering rodents. The general peered eagerly into the crowd, picking out faces. There was the baker armed with a rolling pin. There was a fireman carrying his hose. There were the school mice brandishing water pistols. And there was a police mouse with his club. The whole village had turned out on Tumtum's behalf. "It's an army," the general thought ecstatically. "It's an infestation. And I, the undefeatable General Marchmouse, in the sole command." "Hello there, General," Colonel Acorn cried, pressing his nose through the gate. "Quite a crowd we whipped up this morning, 203 at last count. Sorry we couldn't get back earlier, but that mildew fellow was loitering about in the kitchen, burning toast by the smell of it, and we had to wait ages before it was safe to march everyone across." "Good work, Colonel," the general replied, brusquely pulling open the gates. The officers came through first, and then the village mice surged after them, chattering raucously. They were herded into Nutmouse Hall and then straight through to the ballroom, where they were divided into platoons and each allocated an armband. Finally, General Marchmouse climbed up on top of Tumtum's concert piano to make a rallying speech. "Quiet, please," he bellowed, stretching back his shoulders. "Quiet, please." The general did not like shouting. Before he retired, he had always had a sergeant do it for him. He filled his lungs with air and he tried once more. "Quiet, please, General." Oh, eventually the clamor subsided and the mice turned to face him, all agog as to what was in store for them. Here he is. My goodness. That is quite the piano, isn't it? The general cleared his throat solemnly. He always addressed his men before a battle. He felt it was good for morale, and he was especially pleased with the speech he was about to make now. He had been rehearsing it secretly inside the billiards room. "Mice," he began slowly, "you are gathered here today to face an enemy greater than any of us has ever faced and crueler than any of us has ever known. But the purpose of our expedition is not to injure nor to maim. It is simply to be seen. The enemy is deadly, but her weakness is fear of us. And if she sees enough of us leaping out from the bookcase, springing from the windowsill, descending from the chimney, spilling out of the stuffing in the sofa, deluging her from every corner of the room." The general paused for effect. He needed to make his strategy sound more foolproof than it was. "Well, then she is bound to retreat." One of the mice, standing towards the back of the crowd, raised a grubby paw. "Is that why we're wearing these armbands, General, so we can be seen?" "That is correct, young man," the general replied. "We shall be charging the enemy by night, and her den may be ill-lit. The armbands will ensure that each one of us makes an impression. Be he large or be he small, every mouse among us must be seen." The general hesitated again. He was sure he had planned a much longer speech than this, but he had suddenly lost his thread. Flustered, he started to improvise. "Mice, you have come here as volunteers to defeat an enemy and avenge a friend. As you march into battle, think upon what has befallen our beloved Tumtum lying wretched on his chaise lounge, and think about the consequences if Aunt Ivy remains untamed. At noon tomorrow, her gas supply will arrive, and what hope for Tumtum then? But remember, above all, that this is not merely a battle of mice against men. It is a battle of right versus wrong. It is a battle of courage versus cowardice." General Marchmouse had become very red in the face and was starting to wheeze. He drew his sword from his scabbard and flourished it wildly in the air. "It is the charge of the Bright Brigade!" A deep volt of electricity surged through the army, punching the air with their bright orange sleeves. The soldiers chorused back the war cry, "The charge of the Bright Brigade!" And there was not a mouse among them who was not longing for it to begin. Chapter 12 is next. I will show you the first picture. It's getting exciting.